If you write it down as a blog post, one, you get a free blog post you can publish now. And two, now everything is on paper. You just get your thought in an order. So it will be much easier to create that in a video format that you can present to other people. And finally, practice with friends and colleagues. And again, I'm saying it here now. If you want to create something, I'll volunteer to help critique or help you polish the work. And yes. So yeah, if you want to reach out, and I'll be more than happy. And I'm pretty sure a lot of people in the Go community will be more than happy to help you create courses and things around the Go ecosystem. And my skill set mostly go around Go and containers. So if that is something you are dealing with and you want to create something around, I'll be more than happy to help. Content tips, and your mileage may vary, obviously. If it's a technical course, start with an example in mind. Oftentimes, it's much easier when you have already an example, and going from there, things are easier to explain in context rather than just like raw format. Second is assume as little as possible. Don't just assume people would know this. Even if the course you are trying to teach is a much higher level course, at least try to give them ways to skill up to it. Like, for example, links to other things that they might find useful. And finally, set expectations early and well. You should be very clear about what this course is about, what are they going to learn, and that should be like the first thing you tell them, so that by the end, either it matched and they're very happy, or at the beginning they find out this course is not for them, and that's fine, right? Not everything it should be for everyone. TLDR, so create a course workshop because it makes the whole community better and makes Go more richer. So do it. And two, you have something to share. Everybody has something to share. And finally, have fun with it. Creating something after the end, it's a lot of fun once you have finished it, once you got to share with people. So finally, I would love to see what you all create. I hope there is about 50 to 60 of you here. I want to see about 60 new courses next month, but if there's no 60, at least 30. So if you create something, tweet at me and I'll be so happy. And if you tell me that this influenced you a little bit, it'll mean the world to me. So with that, I will end my talk. Thank you so much. And did I stop sharing? I did.
No, you're still sharing, Mofi.
I am still sharing. How do I stop sharing? That is, oh, here it is. Got it. I stopped sharing.
Yes, awesome. Great talk. Thank you so much, Mofi. Really appreciate it. Once again, just want to iterate, we posted the title inside of the GopherCon 2020 Meetup channel. Sorry, posted the title in the channel. And feel free to thread your questions there. Now I have the pleasure of introducing someone I met back when I was in New York. Anthony Starks. He's an IT architect and Go enthusiast. He's been doing a lot of work with visualizations and Go and Deck and Deckish. Today he's going to be updating us on all the projects that he's been working on since March, working on an abstract for his work in the toolkits, and and show us some of those great visualizations that he has gone. All right, Anthony, the floor is yours. Thank you. No sound.
We don't hear you just yet, Tony.
We can't hear you just yet, Anthony. I don't know if you have double mute.
Can't expect to do a remote meetup without some kind of technical difficulty. I think it comes with the territory.
Well, I didn't know my slide is going to come back that quickly, but extra time for technical difficulties.
You wonder why I padded.
Yeah, Tony, you want to probably look into your audio devices and see if you're selecting the right microphone. Zoom sometimes selects the random one that is not actually carrying audio. Maybe it's under sound and output. I saw sound somewhere. Here it is. Okay.
Getting a real life tutorial on how to troubleshoot sound issues.
You want to check your devices under Zoom, because Zoom selects I have like 9 devices as microphone, and 5 of them carry no audio. I don't know why Zoom does that, but I don't see any. Maybe on the more, if you click on the more, oh boy. Yeah, so if you click on under more, you will see some audio settings and you get to select a device. That is also true. So when we looked at your microphone, there was no audio, like the green showing how much audio you're getting in there.
If you click there's a little up arrow next to the mute button.
On his screen, I didn't see it, so I'm not sure if he has more than one device on, like, if yeah.
Optionally, you could dial in. There's a switch to phone audio.
Switch to another machine. Okay.
Cool.
We could
So
shuffle
then-
this.
All right, he's gonna switch.
I mean, in the meantime, we could answer some. Mofi, if you want to answer some of your questions.
Sure. I mean, there's not much question. I didn't think, but
Well, two. One is, what's the presentation software that you're using? Clearly.
oh well, Google
Right.
Slides. Yeah. So that was a short one. I don't think I can pad 5 minutes with talking about Google Slides.
No, but is there? I think the second one's very interesting as well. Is there any secrets to get inspiration for courses? We run workshops in our Meetup, but we're running out of ideas. That's from Alexander.
Oh yeah. So I think it is best when you start with a problem you're trying to solve, because that way you'll have interest through and through. In a dire need, you could just crowdsource and ask people what they are like trying to build and pick the best idea from there. But the best start is almost always thinking of something you want to build and just go start do that. For example, the last course I created was, I've been using Go concurrency for a while, but I was always like, I don't probably know all the things Go concurrency can do. So I wanted to create a course around that. So I got, like, it gave me an excuse to dive deeper into the docs, dive deeper into the different things you could do, all the patterns you can learn. Not all of them, maybe as many as that I can. So that was useful. But at the same time, let's say another course I'm looking at right now is with WebSockets and Go. So I'm thinking of building like one of those like online board games, and WebSockets probably will be useful. So yeah, because pandemic, everybody's stuck. Board games are great, and I play many of them, but I can't have friends over. So this is the worst. Yeah, so that's probably something I can create things about, because now that's something I'm going to actually use. So that's always a good start when you are using something yourself.
Thank you. We have another question, which is from Anthony. Said, can you elaborate on control the imposter syndrome?
Oh boy. So one short example, on my very first conference that I ever was selected to speak at, I went to the conference, and the first person I was speaking after, so he is the #1 user of Stack Overflow, right? So like #1 user as in like he has the most upvotes on Stack Overflow. So like I was feeling basically worthless compared to him at the same time. So I was speaking to him after the fact, and he told me that there is about like 8 things in his list that he doesn't understand, and he's gonna go back and learn. He has been in the industry for over 36 years. So after that, I kind of, oh, Anthony's back. Yeah, so if he has things that he doesn't know, I don't think there is barely any person in the world that just knows everything. So everybody doesn't know something. It's just a way to kind of do your best and then rely on, hey, Tony, rely on your peers to kind of keep you honest in being better every day. And that's,
Can you hear me now?
we can. Excellent.
Beautiful.
Welcome back, Anthony. Welcome back.
All right. Okay.
All right.
All
Floor's
right.
yours.
Thank you, Matthew.
No problem. I'm sorry. Let me share my screen. Okay, can you guys see me okay? Everything good?
Beautiful.
Perfect. Okay, so apologies, but we're going to talk to you about still going during the pandemic. So when I think of the pandemic, I think of this particular event. Angelica invited me to do a workshop on March the 4th, 2020. And here's a selfie of me in front of the New York Times during that particular event. And when I think of the pandemic and stuff like that, when it starts, this is the event that I think of. Because 1 week later, the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic. And we came into this particular time where time just sort of came into a new thing, a new way to think about it, as the words, as the dates just sort of flow into each other, as I sort of wanted to illustrate in this particular picture here. And when I was thinking about it, as the pandemic was upon us and so forth, as Wilkin had said, I love visualizations. So I wanted to take a look at the data and to see how it was going and tracking it. So I wrote a tool to grab data from Johns Hopkins and plot it using some of the tools that I've created with DexShell and dchart. And here's, for example, some of the early data from April as things were just starting to ramp up. And I also created a standalone program called C19 Chart, which you can grab yourself, which automated the process of grabbing the data and plotting it and creating it. And so I can get a visualization of what's going on a daily basis. But as we talked about, we're in a different kind of time period now. And as Mofi talked about, we've got more time to actually work on some things. And as said before, I'm interested in Go and graphics and GUIs and visualizations. And there's two toolkits that are out there now. One called Fine.io, and the other one called Geo. And I wanted to explore both of these because I knew that of their existence. Geo was created, was actually presented at last year's GopherCon. Geo from Elias Nauer and Fine from Andrew Williams. And the two links that you see there are a couple of toolkits that I've written based upon those two. But there's a motivation here. The motivation is a desire for a Go API for developers and designers to think in terms of high-level objects that make up a display. Objects that are familiar with folks who are using an illustration program like Adobe Illustrator, where you've got text and images and lines and arcs and circles and so forth. And that API should facilitate the artful arrangements of these elements on a 2D canvas. So I sort of explored this with SVG Go, but I wanted to now be able to write native Go applications. Both of those toolkits are actually cross-platform from Mac, PC, Linux, Windows, and mobile. And the use cases for that are information displays, data visualizations, creative coding, and so forth. The main thing around this particular work is a percent grid, where you think in terms of 0 to 100 in an X and Y coordinate and placing things on that grid. Here are the elements for Find. The name of the toolkit is FC, stands for Find Canvas, where you've got text, circles, lines, rectangles, and so forth, and images. And here are some of the clients for that. You may think that there's not a lot of there in terms of elements, but again, the artful arrangements of those few primitives can get you pretty far. I want to point out, the one on the lower right is a full charting package based upon these particular primitives. For Geo, it's got a little bit more graphical richness in terms of its elements. This is what I call the placemat for Geo, where you've got lines, circles, arcs, ellipses, different kinds of curves, rectangles, polygons, squares, and images. And of course, this particular thing was written in Geo. And here are some of the same kinds of clients. It's very interesting to write those clients in two different toolkits to sort of test, is my abstraction correct? The other thing that I want to point out is with writing toolkits like this, your tests become a whole lot prettier. The ones at the lower bottom, those are test runs for particular aspects. So polar coordinates, lines, transformations, and text. So instead of, how you do Go test and so forth, you can see your graphical Go tests. One of the things that really is interesting to me was the use of Slack during this process. Both of these toolkits have Slack channels under Go, # and pound Geo. And I've used them for two different methods. One showing works in progress. So you just begin a thread and you can just start pumping things there, and you can carry on conversations, you can show progress of the things that you're working on. And one thing that I want to point out, both Elias and Andrew, who are the creators of their respective toolkits, are active in their Slack channels. And it's always nice to get some nice feedback, as Elias says, very nice, in the toolkits there. And I can ask my questions, as in the case for asking Andrew there. And he's always willing to ask questions. And it's nice to be able to give back too, as people ask questions as well of you. Okay, so switching gears a little bit. During 2009, in the summer and fall, I embarked upon a project of recreating some visualizations from 120 years ago. W.E.B. Du Bois created, and his team created, visualizations for the 1900 Paris Exposition to talk about the progress of African Americans from emancipation to that point. And there's been a lot of academic work looking at these visualizations from both a historical and design perspective. So it's very interesting to go through each of these. There are 55 presentations here. If you can see behind me, there's a poster of what you see there on the screen. And this was also a good test of some of the tools that I was working on, because they were created with a tool that I call DexShell, which is just a scripting language, a little language, if you will, for these kinds of things. And it's interesting to compare what people did back in 1900, where they used pen and ink and watercolor and paper, and they used the Expo to distribute their data, and comparing that using scripting and digital fonts and so forth. And one of the things that was very interesting to me also was, let's compare the data from 120 years ago, and let's take contemporary data and compare that. Again, using the same style. Again, this is showing the occupations of two different groups in Georgia, and then also updating that data for 2020 using data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And as I've been working with this, this project and this data, a few academic colleagues have latched on and we've worked together from Princeton University and UC Irvine. And what we're trying to do is to promulgate this notion of the Du Bois style of visualization, where we've got a website that we're planning, we're going to have a community around it and so forth. And one of the things that I did was just to start off is to create, as we do these days, an Instagram for Du Bois visualizations. Again, these were all created with Go tools. There is one more thing though. So as I was working through the illustration, the toolkits and so forth, it occurred to me that it would be nice to have illustrations in our Go documentations. If you're a Go programmer and you're writing packages and so forth, you know about sort of the documentation standards. And one of the things that I have is a proposal, a Go proposal. It's gone through, it's starting to go through that process, which is a very interesting process. If you've got things that you want changed about the Go ecosystem, going through the proposal process is something that I would recommend. But the idea here is to have illustrations in your documentation, especially for things that need it, like graphical toolkits and so forth, as well as if you've got tricky algorithms and so forth, where an illustration will really, really help. So we're starting to go through that process. There's the link to the Go issue. If you'd like to participate and give me comments, I would love that. Thanks for all your time. These are links to all the things that I've talked about. And thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
So just a reminder, we're going to be doing Q&A threaded in our GopherCon 2020 Meetup Slack channel. So
Perfect.
Feel free to kind of Slack that, and then we'll come back to questions at the end.
Beautiful. Thanks for your time, everybody.
Thank you so much. So now we're going to move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Tim Raymond. He's a senior software engineer at Microsoft. He's going to be telling us a little bit about how to conduct workshops. In his own words, he said, workshops are a little different from conference talks. For one, they're considerably longer. So how do you go about putting one together? So we'll cover what Tim's learned over the years in assembling workshops, selecting material, as well as some special considerations for your audience and attendees. So I'm going to pass over to Tim. Are you there? Maybe we'll give him a few minutes. If not, we could ask you some questions, not to put you on the spot, Anthony. If your audio's come back. Okay,
I'm back. How's that? Is that better?
So we have two questions, one more serious than the other, but I think both very important. The first is, do you have any beard grooming pro tips?
I'm sorry.
Anthony says that your beard is amazing, and I agree.
Thank you. You can see the growth from March to now. So yes, yeah, this is definitely the Corona beard.
Just a quick note. Tim said he was going to be away from keyboard. He'll be back in approximately 4 minutes.
Okay, great.
And then your second question, which came actually in the Zoom Q&A feature, which I just discovered we had, is, do you think Go will be as important as C or C++ in their respective time?
I think yes. I think especially for the areas that Go is really, really good at, and in terms of creating services and so forth, I think it's already sort of made its way for that. When you think of C and C++, those are actual languages of their time. And I think Go is actually a language of its time in terms of the cloud and so forth. And it's also very useful for me for the things that I'm doing. So I would say thumbs up, yes.
We had another question come in, which is, do you like Fine or Geo better?
They're different. Geo makes you do a lot more work in terms of doing things. It's kind of a lower level, but it's also richer in terms of the graphical elements that are there. And then again, one of the things that I'm looking for is to have kind of an abstraction above both of them for writing the kinds of things that I'm saying. Geo tends to be a little bit more verbose, Fine a little bit more concise. But they're interesting because Geo is immediate mode where every frame you compute and so forth, and that's a different way of thinking about it. Fine is very much really thinking about making really, really good cross-platform experience and working through the widgets. So they've been spending a lot of time on their widget stuff. One more thing to point out is the Geo is really thinking about what the good back end should be and working with GPUs and so forth as well. So it's interesting to compare the both.
Thank you.
It's awesome. This is great. I think we have a few more minutes before Tim comes back online. I'm really curious to know when he shows up at exactly 1:50, how accurate that time is. It's quite nice. Oh, and there he is. Welcome. Tim.
We'll have to wait for that many lovely Gopher toys.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm a bit earlier than what I said, but got my water and.
Very, very impressive. Very impressive. So welcome, Tim.
Thank you.
Awesome. So I guess I'll pass it right over.
Works for me. So I'm ready to get started. I actually don't have anything to share, so there's nothing wrong on your end or anything. I'm just going to talk. If that's cool.
That's awesome.
Okay. So anyway, thank you, Angelica. Thank you, Wilkin, for having me. I really love the pre-conference meetups. It's one of the things that I personally miss in the pandemic times here, but it's great that we've been able to get that experience for a virtual conference. So it's pretty exciting. So I wanted to come by today to talk a little bit about how I go about planning a conference workshop. And this, I'm giving one of the workshops at GopherCon. And I wanted to talk about it because I've had a few speakers ask me how I go about planning a workshop, because it is a little bit longer, or quite a bit longer than your ordinary conference talk. And there's a few different considerations for doing that. So there's kind of like three broad phases, I guess, that I think about. And that would be like a kind of a broad planning phase. There's more of a preparation, or like more of an actual construction phase. And then there's the actual delivery, which has a few other different considerations. But before we start talking about those, I want you to think about a conference workshop as not just a long monolithic talk with like various bits of examples and exercises broken up in between. A conference workshop is really more of a playlist of individual conference talks. And you can develop each one of those talks individually. And they all have kind of an overarching theme throughout them. So think more like a season of a TV series where you might have an overall plot goal, but each individual episode is typically written by different writers. In this case, the writer is entirely you, but it doesn't actually have to be. You can use other people's material for certain goals that you're trying to accomplish during your workshop. But if we're starting with a broad planning phase, just starting from scratch, which is really quite rare to start from scratch, because you'll find if you do these often enough, you have some material to recycle. But if we're starting completely from scratch with a new topic, I usually like to start with just a simple mind map. And for those of you who haven't seen that technique before, it's starting with just a really broad idea. Let's take, for example, something like monitoring and Go. And monitoring is just this huge space of topics. So we would take that and we just stick it right in the middle of a piece of paper, or whiteboard works particularly well. So we put that right in the middle, and we would start breaking that down by drawing lines off of that. And you might think of various subtopics, things like, for example, instrumenting our Go code. Or maybe another topic would be like, how do we make sense of the various statistics that come back from the Go runtime? Or how do we actually run, for example, like the Prometheus backend? And what about configuration, that kind of thing? So we come up with all of these individual subtopics, and we might break those down even further by drawing like additional lines from that. At some point, you will have leaves on the end of this big graph, where you can then have enough material there for an individual conference talk. And that should be somewhere in the range of like 25 to 45 minutes, probably. Your time limits will vary, and that's something you should think of. But also at the same time, while you're planning this out, it's important to keep in mind the exercises and the examples that you'll use throughout, because you'll have quite a bit of content. So having some kind of common theme can be really helpful to come up with different examples and exercises when you need them. So, for example, if we take this monitoring and Go thing, we might think of like an e-commerce type of application. Maybe we're selling Gophers, and we need to. We'll have a front end with that, and we'll have a back end and database, and you can think of all kinds of different pieces of this. So it's incredibly like fertile ground to draw examples from and exercises. And ultimately, with these examples and exercises, we're trying to get to a place where we can have a flow of I do, then we do, and then you do. And the I do phase is when you will present some kind of concept. And that can just be like go on a slide and you talk about it. The we do phase might be a little bit of live coding, and ideally taking some input from your audience. It's a little bit harder to do in a virtual setting, but still possible to do. And finally, the you do phase is when you pass off the example into an exercise for your attendees to actually work on and implement something on their own. So once you've have this broad idea of the different pieces that you're going to do, then you can start to focus in on one specific thing and start actually expanding it into a mini conference talk. So one technique that I like to do for that is to actually free write on a topic. And this is kind of a technique that I actually read about that I guess Richard Feynman used for like learning things. So if you're not particularly like expert at one aspect of something you want to present on, you can actually just write out longhand as though you're trying to teach somebody else about whatever it is that you're going to teach. And if you don't understand something, or you're a little bit fuzzy on something, you can always put a placeholder in there. TK is quite popular in like publishing because it's very easy to search for. So you can have those little markers. You can go back and do some research, expand on those things. And the other great thing about having a piece of free writing like that is that you can use that to figure out how close you are or how much over you've gone your time limit, because the average speaker speaks somewhere around 130 to 140 words per minute. And you can use that fact in combination with your time limit to figure out how many words you need to put on a page. So the goal of that, of course, isn't to read verbatim. We don't want a completely canned speech. So it's only really a means to come up with what you should cover and what you shouldn't and how much detail. So once I have that, I like to take that and then actually extract an outline from that piece of free writing. And once I have that outline, which is pretty detailed at this point, and it might have some placeholders for examples and things like that, then I can actually like make slides. And from that, it's pretty close to what I want to say during a particular part of the workshop. Now, the next part is, now that I have slides, it's time to test. So we love testing in Go, and testing works great in workshops too. And testing your material looks like going to a meetup with a talk. And your local meetup organizer will love you because you will always have talks to bring, because you will have a lot of them in a workshop. So if you let them know that you will probably have a talk available, they will be your new best friend when when they're looking for speakers. So when you're giving a section of a workshop for a meetup, it's worthwhile to tell your audience that you're testing this material out, and if you have any feedback or if something wasn't exactly clear, please let me know, because otherwise you won't always get that feedback. So it's helpful to let people know that you're open to that. So you'll also want to write down any good questions that come up. Feel free to take some time to do that, so you can work it back into the material. And the same thing goes for like any bugs that come up in your examples and that kind of thing. So once you have that portion, it's time to actually deliver that for real. You might have different kinds of audience questions that come up during the actual conference talk. And it's a little bit different in this virtual environment, because usually we didn't even really think about audience questions because people just asked them and you answered them. But in a virtual environment, it's better now. We've kind of found in this whole learning process that if people put questions in chat, it's a little bit easier to organize that as a speaker and like address it at a good time. And it's helpful while you're developing your material to figure out when those good times would be. So those are my broad thoughts, and hopefully this can help you all kind of think about maybe making your own workshops when you're learning new things. If you're interested in helping out with workshops or anything like that, I know that Women Who Go has quite a few workshops. Actually, I gave one of my first workshops for Women Who Go. And so we're always looking for TAs and that kind of thing. So I encourage you to get in touch with the organizers, and they will be happy to help, I'm sure. So that's all I have, and thank you very much.
Awesome, Tim. Thank you so much. It's good to hear. I feel like there's a lot of good content coming down about doing remote learning or remote teaching in the workshops, which is always good. I feel like myself, and I'm sure others, always wanting to give back and do workshops. It's like, where do we get started? What's all the things that come into play? So super great. We're doing really good on time. I know there's a question. I don't know, Tim, if you want to answer it now, or if maybe you just want to hold off to the QA section. But we are doing really good on time here. And would you be open to answering questions now? We have one inside the Slack if you're open for it.
I can do that. Yeah. I'm looking in the Zoom chat, so I'll have to switch over.
Don't worry, I got it. I'll read it through.
Okay, if you want
I
to.
was gonna say, Wilkin, you can read it.
Sounds good. That sounds good. How do you make sure your workshops are accessible to all levels attending?
That's a challenge. I think one of the most important things is to try to communicate prerequisites as much as possible. It's not always going to be possible to make your material accessible to everyone. I mean, like skill level wise. So, and also the other thing is making sure that the sequencing of materials is correct, and that's one of the things that you can kind of find out through maybe giving different phases of a talk at meetups. I mean, this is maybe one of the things that I would ask afterward at a meetup. Find out if maybe I should present one thing or another before or after. But yeah, I would say try to play around with ordering of things too. And maybe the one time, like I've done this a few times with things like channels and mutexes and things like that. I've tried like presenting channels first, and I've tried presenting like mutexes first. And over time, I've found that channels are a little bit easier to present first than mutexes, and even though like channels internally use mutexes, so it's there's a little bit of experimentation there that has to happen, and it's not exactly the cleanest process in the world.
Cool. Well, cool. Well, thanks for taking the time to answer that. I'm sure the Angelica who posed the question is listening intently, so quite nice. Awesome. Thank you, Tim. Again, everyone, I just want to remind everyone that the question, we have the Tim's title pinned to the channel. So if you have any more questions throughout the other talks, feel free to drop it in there, and then we'll have a dedicated Q&A session later on today to answer some more questions. Thanks, Tim. All right, moving straight along. It's my pleasure to introduce Doug Donahue. He's a senior software engineer at the New York Times. He's going to be talking about his journey today to GopherCon. His idea of, hey, I should give a talk at GopherCon, and reality being COVID-19. He's going to sort of tell us that story and that journey. So, Doug, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Can confirm that you can hear me. Thumbs up. All right, thank you. I'm going to share my screen here. Where is the button? Okay. All right. Yeah, so as the intro stated, my name is Doug Donahoe. I'm with the New York Times. I'm going to talk to you about what the path was to presenting at GopherCon. So first, a little bit about myself. I'm based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Pre-COVID, I like to travel a lot. I've been on a lot of hiking trips. This photo is of me in Switzerland. That's not photoshopped. It's just good timing by my wife. Prior to my time at the New York Times, way back in the day, I worked out in Silicon Valley in California. I worked for Netscape and Blue Martini Software in the sort of the first e-commerce systems ever made. I then had my own company for a little while writing computer games. I had a little bit of success with something called DD Poker, which is for playing Texas Hold'em with friends online, which was kind of fun. I then did a couple startups in the Midwest. I moved back to basically Minneapolis and Chicago. Retrofit was fun. I was the CTO there of a health and wellness startup competing with Weight Watchers. I did a small stint at Google, and then I'm at the New York Times now. My languages I've worked in predominantly, like the most miles on the car, so to speak, is Scala and Java. I've done a little bit of Groovy back in the day. I've done a few projects in Python and Ruby. And then a long time ago, when I was at Netscape, it was C and C++. But now I've been doing quite a bit of Go here at the New York Times, and it's been really fun. So this idea of GopherCon was, I first became aware of it at an internal New York Times users group meeting last December. And I had been working on some stuff which was pretty interesting. I'd been able to solve a problem that had been sort of dogging us for 3 years. And I thought maybe it would be interesting to talk about that. I was still like brand new to Go. I'd been writing in it for maybe 2.5 months. The deadline for submissions, we learned, was January 10th. And the problem was I was going to be out of the country. I went to New Zealand last Christmas and New Year's for over 2 weeks. And so I was going to have basically 5 days left to prepare a submission for my talk. I wasn't sure if that was doable or not. So I took a look at what it took to actually prepare a talk. This, if you want to look for yourself, you can call it the call for proposal, as they call it, is still up there. And this is what they wrote for potential presenters or authors. The key bullets I highlight there on the left side of the screen is relevance. You know, it has to be about Go, not just software development. It has to be clear. You sort of know what you're talking about. Correct. Like I had to demonstrate some knowledge. What I wanted to talk about had to be achievable, and then there had to be some impact. Like why the heck would I want to give a talk on that? So these links they posted at the bottom, like how to prepare a conference proposal, were very helpful to me. Basically, this too long didn't read is you have to be very detailed. You have to really think about what you want to prepare. So the submission form was a little daunting because you had to ask for a bunch of things. Title, what am I going to call my talk? That's sort of the headline, or here in the New York Times, we call it the head. And then there was the elevator pitch. You know, what is in 300 characters or less, which is like 2 sentences, why is my talk going to be cool? Then I had to give a description, which is sort of like a couple paragraphs about it. That's seen by the reviewers, potentially published for the attendees, but things changed this year. Some notes about myself, like why would you pick me? And then a detailed talk outline. They wanted a creative, clear explanation of why this is unique. And they had some other points which I thought were good. One is they're encouraging first-time speakers. So I've never presented at a conference. I've done some local meetups and some internal talks at companies, but never at a conference like this. They're prioritizing new content. So I think what I was talking about would be new. And then they also had a double-blind selection process to try and remove biases from the selection. So I thought, oh, those were encouraging things. The other thing that occurred to me is, wow, preparing for this is going to take quite some time. How was I going to get through all this in just a few days? Well, the first thing was, with any sort of creative process, is just start where you can start. So I started with a title, and my title was about the work I was doing, which was reordering 59 million New York Times publishing assets using Go and BadgerDB. Sort of the focus of my talk, I figured, was, you know, how I used BadgerDB. It was an interesting technology, and also solving this problem we had at the New York Times of ordering all of these publishing assets. And then I spent some time coming up with my elevator pitch, which was basically this. So every version of every New York Times article since 1851 and related assets is stored in Kafka, but it's not 100% ordered chronologically or topologically. And this talk is going to be about how we reorder those events in memory, essentially using BadgerDB. And I wanted to provide code and lessons learned. And the rest of the process did take some time. I ended up writing over 2,000 words just for the conference proposal. It was 7 pages long. The outline itself, which was the sort of pre-planning the talk, was 152 bullets. And that whole process took me about 7 hours. So it was essentially an entire day spread across a couple of work days. But this is, I've always had this metric when I'm writing documentation. I always think of it takes me an hour to write a page. And that's held true for a long time when you're wordsmithing and reorganizing stuff. So, you know, these proposals can take some time to think through. And I submitted it on the last day with 7.5 hours to spare. And now I had to wait. Are they going to choose my talk or not? You know, was I thorough enough, or is my talk interesting enough? Well, it turns out the GopherCon folks were pretty quick. I was actually notified of my selection about a month later, on February 12th. And I thought, hey, good, I can just wait and I'll procrastinate. I've got 4.5 months to write this talk. I don't really need to worry about it now. And then March 12th, COVID hits. I remember March 12th, sitting on my couch and like reading my Twitter and seeing NBA canceled and Major League Baseball suspended, the NCAA tournament suspended. So like, as several people mentioned, life sort of ground to a halt there. And then not soon after that, although in 2020 timeframe, that was like 6 years later, the conference was postponed. And they were still optimistic that they could have it live. The original conference was going to be in Disney World, and they postponed it to mid-November, also to be at Disney World. I was kind of skeptical that this was going to happen, but who knows what the course of the pandemic would take. But I got to procrastinate even more. Now I have 5.5 months to write my talk. And then on July 10th, they finally decided, this was like in the peak of the second wave of the COVID infections over the summer. They finally decided to do a virtual. This must have been a tough call. They had to completely change the format, but it was a good call. I still had 4 months to write my talk. So I continued to procrastinate. And then on September 2nd, they reached out to us and said, hey, we've decided we're not going to do these talks live. We're going to pre-record them. Your new deadline is 10/9. I was like, duh. I guess I got to write my presentation now. So it's basically time to get to work. The good news is that as I forget which of the previous speakers, maybe it was Mafi, said, it's good to like write some posts. So I'd actually spent time, New York Times has this cool blog called NYT Open, where we write about the technology aspects of various parts of putting out the report, as we call it. So I had spent the first half of the year not so much procrastinating on the talk, but procrastinating on this article. And so it helped to have an editor and some deadlines. But eventually in the end of July, I had published this. So this was sort of a written form of all the bullets I'd put together previously. I think writing this took me about 20 hours. It's interesting working with an editor. I'd never done that before. They really crispified my language. They made me aware of my audience was maybe less technical than I thought they were. So these were all good things that I've gotten to my head as I was preparing the conference talk. Literally sit down to work, started creating the talk on September 11th. And then I ended up with 60 slides for a 45-minute talk. And it took me about 40 hours to really create and refine the entire talk. And I want to show you 4 of my favorites. So the first favorite is this. This basically is some PowerPoint animation, Mojo, Jiu-Jitsu, where I'm basically showing the relationship between different assets in our system. And so the thing I wanted to show is that, you know, this is this shows how things are related. Articles refer to images and they have subjects and they might be written by an author. But when we publish them, woo, fancy. We have everything goes in like in a single topic on Kafka. So I wanted to visualize this. I spent, probably an hour tweaking the motion paths in PowerPoint to get that sort of effect to work, but I'm pretty happy with it. And it's only for like 10 seconds of my talk. Next thing I worked on was this. So part of my talk talks about is sorting 59 million assets using Go a big data problem. And I wanted to have this visualization. Well, could I fit 59 million of these assets? So if we look back at this, I had these colors. So I wanted to reuse these colors and sort of visualize that when I clicked on this next bullet. So I basically swiped down to reveal that image. But the real fun part was like, how did I actually create that grid of colors? So I ended up Googling for grid creation code in like R or Python. And I ended up finding this computer assignment from some university which was teaching Python. And they had like the skeleton of a solution, and you had to figure out the rest. So I actually ended up having to do some comp sci assignment. And this was the code. Pretty simple Python code. I'd never written anything like this. And I essentially had to figure out the middle 3 lines in that double for loop there, which was kind of fun. just to create this one section of this one slide, I had to dip down into Python for a little bit. And this is what it looked like when you ran it. So I just threw up a window. I quickly copied that and pasted it into PowerPoint. So that's how I created that effect. My third favorite is this. So if you look for my NYT open post, I actually used some iPad software to draw this image called GoodNotes. And I wanted to have something slightly crisper and animated for my talk. So I ended up creating this from that slide with this animation, which basically shows I'm taking a bunch of events and I'm compressing them and putting them into a key value database. So this was another sort of playing with PowerPoint animations that I had fun with. And then finally, my last favorite slide is this slide, which shows data on the monologue before and after. So this is before, and you can listen to my talk to understand why it looks like this. But what the fun part of was actually creating this graph is I had to dig down into R. So I had learned R a few years ago through Coursera, just for taking a class on statistics. And so I had been familiar with the sort of things you can do in R. And this is the code that actually renders those plots. And the data itself, I didn't have time to put in here, but it's essentially just 2 columns of data. There's an offset, a year, and then the number of occurrences in that year, I think. So the program I wrote, oops, going the wrong way. The 2 CSV files here I wrote, that was a Go program that iterated through the data relatively quickly and spit out the summary stuff. So one of the cool things of my talk I talk about is how the iteration speed of using Badger and Go made it quick to explore data and do stuff like this that we weren't able to do before. So I'll talk real quickly about my recording studio. So I was working with Jose at the GopherCon conference folks. They shipped out all this stuff to me. They basically gave me a shopping list at Amazon, and you can see there's, they're not lit in this picture, but that's what's I'm facing right now. Those 2 light rings with the diffusion socks over them. There's the microphone. There's these 2 stands right now. I have in front of me an iPad, which shows my speaker notes, and then the computer. Let's see what else. So, and then the thing right in the back that's tiny is my tripod that I ended up using my own Sony camera to record myself, because they decided that the quality of the webcam on laptops wasn't quite up to snuff. So you had to either use your iPhone or your smartphone, or if you happen to have an SLR or some other camera. So that part was pretty cool. Is figuring all that out. We installed something called OBS Studio to record the audio and the slides on one stream, and then the video was on another. This is what it might look like. So I sort of tinker around with video production. I've taught myself Final Cut Pro. So I actually took the stuff and merged it together just so I could show my wife my talk. I don't have any idea what they're doing for GopherCon. I'm curious to see. But this is what you can see. The angle of my office I'm in is sort of facing that direction. It's a little more interesting than this one. But that's how my talk might look. And then finally, just some closing thoughts. Creating a presentation is hard work, but it's totally worth it. Plan on spending that time and plan on, you really want to refine the message you're sending and like what are the points that are relevant. It does take some time to sort of craft through that. One other thing I wanted to mention is when I did my recording, I had previously done 2 dry runs. One was internal. I did a shorter version of my talk for dgraph. And then I did a full recording, 45 minutes. I didn't really love everything in there. So I did another one to sort of smooth out the point. So it took me my 4th try really to get something which I'm fairly happy with. So my talk is Wednesday the 11th at 2:10. Hopefully you choose to view it. I appreciate it. And as a reminder, GopherCon 2021 call for papers opens in just over a month. So if you've got something you learned, you want to share it, it doesn't matter if you're new to Go or not. If you think a lesson you've learned would be helpful to other folks in the community, then go for it. All right. And I went over by a minute and 40 seconds. But
It's fine, we have the time.
Um,
We have one question that it would be great to get your answer to if you don't mind, Doug.
Sure, absolutely.
Awesome. So do you have any specific examples of things that your editor pointed out? It would be interesting, I think, for those who don't have the luxury of an editor to see what they're missing and things that they might want to think through when maybe they're writing their own blog posts or something they want to put out there.
So I thought I did a pretty good job of like judging my audience, but I still had too many technical terms in it. I had to explain like what Kafka was in more general terms. I had, I was under the assumption when I first started that I was writing for programmers, but the audience of the NYT Open is for just people who are interested in technology in general. They could be an editor or a product manager. And so my editor helped me recalibrate who my audience was. The other thing that was helpful is just simplifying my language. Like fewer words is better than more words. So she had a target word count that we were aiming for. And so when I write documentation, I tend to like lay everything out very specifically and try to be super detailed. And she helped sort of boil things down to what is the most salient point. It reminds me of I think maybe Mark Twain or someone said, "I'm sorry I've written you this long letter. I didn't have time to make it shorter," which is so true. Like it's, you can Google that, but it's a good quote. And the other reason an editor is good is it's just a different perspective from someone. You're in your head. You're with this thing for hours and hours and hours. You probably overlook things that are obvious to you. So it's just really helpful to have another opinion. And that's why it's good to do dry runs of your talks as well.
Well, thank you. I'm sure we're all looking forward to your talk.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to be introducing our final speaker. His name is John Sabados. He's a senior software engineer at the New York Times, and he's actually on my team, so I'm especially excited about this. He's going to be talking about pointypoints.com, which is a make-a-week project that he worked on. It's about implementing a serverless application, making use of WebSockets with AWS, what went right for him, what went wrong, and what he learned. So I'm going to pass it over to you, John.
Hi, all. Is my audio working? Excellent. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
More fun Gopher toys, I see. You and Tim have that in common.
Yep. Yeah, I don't have anywhere nearly as much, though. I think I need to do some stocking up. All right. So I guess let's get started. So pointypoints.com was actually a Maker Week project. So how did this become a thing? Every year, the New York Times has a Maker Week in which employees are given the freedom to work on self-directed projects where they can experiment with new ideas and technologies. So kind of think like hackathons you might have at other companies. So my project, pointypoints.com, was actually born out of frustration with an online task pointing tool that we use that oftentimes would throw errors, disconnect people, and basically reduce the overall usability of it during one. And I was also looking for what I was going to do for my Maker Week project. During one grooming session, I mentioned the idea of replacing the tool as a project for the week, but I didn't know what to call it. Someone threw out Pointy Points, and before I knew it, I had my AWS account open and was in Route 53 and had registered the domain since it was available. So what exactly is it? And it's a web-based task pointing application. A facilitator can start a session, invite participants who can vote on number of points for a task. There's a little bit more to it, like the facilitator can show votes and whatnot, and you can change votes to come to an agreement. All the actions that are invoked within it are broadcast to all participants in a session via WebSockets, which was the technology that I was interested in experimenting with. I was actually really interested in seeing how it could be a thing in serverless land, since WebSockets are an inherently stateful thing. But if you're working in AWS with Lambdas, state just really isn't a thing. So for the backend, there's basically a collection of small Go lambdas storing state in DynamoDB that are exposed to the world via an API gateway. The front end's actually done in Vue.js and is served out of an S3 bucket sitting behind CloudFront. And it's also an example of infrastructure, of codifying your infrastructure as it uses Terraform to manage all the AWS resources. So how about a picture? I've got this little X-ray generated service map. Kind of neat, but not really useful. So maybe a better architectural picture where we can see we've got Route 53 handling DNS, that actually there's basically 4 records. There's pointypoints.com, www version as well. And then an API gateway for 3 records overall, pointing.pointypoints.com. So that hands out records to clients, points to CloudFront, where we've got a S3 bucket that's sitting with static assets in it, so the compiled Vue.js application, handing things to CloudFront, and then we got API gateway sitting in front of a small collection of lambdas. Then there's a distinct lambda for every function present in it. So like voting for a session, or voting is handled by one lambda. Joining a session is handled by another, disconnects are handled by another, and so forth. And then it stores all of its state in DynamoDB. And then it also uses DynamoDB for some distributed locking mechanisms. Okay, so what's kind of cool about Pointy Points? Because really it doesn't do anything groundbreaking. It's just a kind of simple application to vote on points and whatnot and come to agreement. And it doesn't generate any revenue, but it does have some kind of cool aspects. It's entirely serverless. So outside of Route 53, all the services that it's using in AWS are billed by usage. And so with the current traffic levels, which is next to nothing, it fits entirely within the free tier. So it costs me all of 51 cents a month to run in Route 53 fees. The infrastructure is entirely codified and managed by Terraform and easily repeatable. If someone wanted to, they could snag the code, build it, and deploy it to their own AWS account with very limited manual action. And actually, the homepage of pointypoints.com has a link to the GitHub repo for it, so that's all readily available. You do have some manual configuration, like purchasing the Route 53 domain and then some SSM parameters, but that's about it. Another thing that's cool is that it's got workspace support. So this is a Terraform feature. So multiple instances can be run within a single AWS account. So basically create a workspace and do a Terraform init, and it's going to spin up all of the pieces of Pointy Points, including an API gateway and whatnot, sitting parallel with the main one. And then, well, it's making use of WebSockets. WebSockets are pretty cool for me because it's actually, I do mostly backend development, so it's not something that I have an opportunity to play with, and they were entirely new to me walking into this. So what went well with this? I actually already had a project using Terraform Go, Go Lambdas and Vue.js for similar deployment, basically on my personal playground. And I was able to use that as a template, allowing me to focus on the new shiny things like WebSockets. So it was nice that I didn't have a bunch of groundwork to do to just get running with the thing that I wanted to focus on during Maker Week. Another thing that went really well with it is that the AWS ecosystem is complete enough, and the Terraform support for it is strong enough that I was able to do basically everything I needed to do through code. You can create ACM certificate requests, the DNS validation records to make those go through, and then apply those certificates to a CloudFront distribution entirely within AWS via Terraform. And so that's some of the stuff that like GCP doesn't have any sort of certificate service that you can use. So fun with AWS there. Terraform workspaces also allowed me to have lower environments that I could mess with and blow up without having to wreck anything that was running in prod, or having to set up a separate AWS account for, or just deploying the prod like my personal playground. I used to just deploy to it. I've since ported the workspace support for that. I even had some time to write some unit tests and a GitHub workflow to execute them for basic CI, because I actually hadn't played with GitHub workflows before. So what hung me up? and this is a kind of an ongoing theme that I've encountered when getting code running in AWS. You spend a little bit writing code, and then you spend hours trying to get it to work, and oftentimes due to some sort of permission issues. Pointy Points was no exception. After an initial burst of productivity, copying my project over as my template and trimming it down, I started work on my first Lambda, went to deploy it, cranked out some small code, some makefile work, and then I fell into a hole that would cost me hours of my life, and most importantly, a full day of Maker Week. You only got 5 days. Losing a day to something silly kind of sucks. I've long since given up on the idea of clicking through the AWS UI for anything but really simple lab style experiments, and instead start from Terraform, as it makes repeating my work and rolling back things fairly straightforward. I thought that getting the API gateway and Lambda invocation bit working should be no problem, because it's something I've done before with API gateway v1 and RESTful endpoints in the past. It's kind of tedious. There's a number of different pieces, but I at least thought I knew what I was going to need. But the thing that hung me up was getting the statement for Lambda permissions, allowing the API gateway to invoke the Lambda correct. Specifically, I was stumped on what the source ARN for the API gateway would be when things were combined with WebSockets. I was also complicated by something that I was doing with Terraform, corrupting things in a way that kind of blew up my entire gateway, which made it hard for me to actually try and duplicate things through the console, because I would go through the console and try and set it up by hand, and or through there, and it still didn't work. Finally, in a fit of anger, I did a Terraform destroy, blew away everything, and then reapplied, and it just worked. Once I had everything working, I created a module for endpoints with a Terraform module, which is kind of a way of reusing code in Terraform, that I should have called a route to match up with the terminology for the API gateway and WebSockets, but just a naming thing. And this module defined this one little tiny chunk of code that did the permissions that was needed, and that I could apply to new routes without ever having to think about it again. So if you're ever using Terraform and find yourself repeating the same chunks of code, I'd recommend considering modules. The other thing that didn't go well is locks. So there's a number of operations that involved reading a session state, modifying it, and persisting the new state. So like somebody joining a session, voting on a thing or whatever. And I was just storing the sessions as a JSON blob in Dynamo, kind of a quick and dirty store. So I had to get some sort of distributed session locking going. So I threw together some code to use Dynamo to make it happen, and then threw together a test on it, because that was a thing that was really hard to test for real with just one developer working on things. I had to do a unit test for my locking code. And I found out that testing locking code is actually really hard to get right, especially if you want the race argument to work. So I started off with a test that would just panic if locking failed, but then I went to do a make test, and that complained loudly because I always try and run my tests with a -- raced. So I ended up with a locking strategy that worked fine in all my individual testing, but as soon as my team started using it, lock timeouts were encountered, and they blew up whole sessions. But at least it made it through the demos. And actually, so if anybody's curious, this is the initial state of the locking code. I mean, it's nothing too complex, but it's like takes in some arbitrary duration to time out, like spins around and make sure it gets a lock. So let's see, what did I do about the locks? So the initial release of the locking mechanism used where it's undergone 2 iterations. After that initial version where I passed in just an arbitrary timeout, I said, well, why am I doing this? I've got a context that's available to the Lambda that's going to cancel when the Lambda's running out of time. So instead of relying on an arbitrary duration, I can actually start paying attention to context cancellation, and that improves things a bit. But that did leave things in a state where if a lock failed to acquire the context that everything was using has already canceled, so the releasing the lock would blow up because I was passing a context that expired into the underlying Dynamo libraries. So the current version of things, you can see what it looks like now, also has code to check for if the lock is or if the lock needs to be expired. So it's greatly grown in scope. I mean, the initial locking code here looks kind of the same, but then we've got this whole thing of purging a lock if it's expired. So kind of ugly, and there's a lot to it. One thing that I do want to note on this is anytime you're doing development in Go with Lambdas, the context that comes into you has a context or will cancel when the Lambda is running out of time. So always use the functions of things that are context aware. So like all the various AWS clients in Go have a with context version, use those. And then like associate HTTP requests that you have to make with a context as well. So that means you don't have to worry about the timeouts of all your individual calls. It'll just work as a group. So how did it work out having a bunch of tiny small lambdas working together? It's kind of, for me at least, is a unique approach because each one's a small little deployable on its own. And I can see if it were each Lambda were living in a separate project, it'd be a nightmare because you'd end up with duplicated code all over the place, kind of like microservice land, but times 10. But having all of them live in a single project made for easy reuse of code. It does mean that when I go to deploy, it's basically an all or nothing. Every single Lambda gets pushed. I don't really think that's the end of the world because in a real world app, we'd probably be packaging everything up together and like applying the same artifact to multiple environments through some sort of CD tool. So that's not too bad. It does have a make file that is just awful and full of a ton of repetition. So at some point, I'm probably going to get frustrated by that and try to find a better way to do things. On WebSockets. WebSockets are really cool, especially when you have an API gateway that's dealing with the transport layer and you don't have to worry about having machines to keep all those connections open or any of that. The transport layer would be a nightmare. But with API gateway, you don't have to worry about that. That said, I used them for absolutely all the communication between the front end and the back end, and that was a mistake. With WebSockets, there isn't really any sort of request lifecycle. You just shoot messages back and forth. So I'm kind of bothered by what the front end has to do to show a spinner while a vote's in flight, because it basically shoots off a message saying, hey, I'm voting for this amount, and then it waits for a message from the server that's reflecting the session state, and then it looks at its current state for the current vote of the current user and says, okay, if the vote's the same, now I can show it. Very ugly. And it feels like it's held together with duct tape and baling wire. And also right now, there's no feedback to the user if things blow up server side because the request just kind of goes into dev null and the user's left staring at a spinner. So I could theoretically fix that by like having clients generating unique IDs per request and then have the server send messages back when things go wrong. But that assumes that the server doesn't even just crap out, which that can happen with Lambdas. They can just get terminated because they're taking too long. So that would be a scenario where there just isn't any feedback to the client. There's no real way around that. But that's really kind of reinventing the wheel. There's actually an existing scheme for request response lifecycle, and that's our basic HTTP request stuff. So if I were going to be doing this again, I would use a standard REST API for all the actions, like creating a session, joining a session, voting and whatnot, where you need real time, where you need feedback, and then just use WebSockets to broadcast all the updates and session status. Learned a thing. It's good for a Make a Week project. So where does that leave it? Amazingly, Pointy Points came together to the point of being usable within Maker Week, which I was very happy about because it's standing up a whole website and exposing it to the world and all the things that went into it. So happy with that. And my team's actually using it for task pointing. And it's out there in the world and theoretically anybody could if they want. And I've put in some band-aids for the locking code. I'm not sure if I'm going to spend the time to do Pointy Points done right, because like I said, it's not generating revenue and it's not super, super useful. It's just kind of a fun little project. But if I were, I would take all of the actions, or basically take all of the actions out of WebSockets and move them to a RESTful API, and then just do the broadcasting a message through WebSockets. This actually wouldn't be terrible to do because with Lambdas behind API Gateway, and API Gateway dealing with all the transport layer stuff, the Lambdas themselves would mostly be the same. It would just be a change in how they're presented to the world. And then of course, a bunch of changes to the front end code to get that working. I'd also want to figure out a schema for storing session information that didn't require distributed locks, because those distributed locks are a pain. They're slow, and they're spending some time thinking about how stuff is stored would probably have a better schema anyways. And then the other thing remaining is refactoring the code from let's just get this done into something that's actually what thought out better and actually has more tests, because it does have some tests, but they were just, things I had room for. And that's basically was my Maker Week project. Sorry if I went through that kind of fast. New to this whole public speaking thing.
It was great, John. Thanks so much. We shared the link to your GitHub, and there's a few folks asking for the slides if you want to share them in the Gopher Slack. That would be great. Actually, really cool to see everything, what you were able to put together, and all the components, and then take advantage of that Maker Week. So really nice stuff there. Definitely looking forward to diving into the code a little myself. So thanks for sharing. This is again, thank you to all the speakers. John was our last speaker here, and before going into the Q&A, just want to remind everyone once again that the channel, the GopherCon 2020 Meetup channel, all the questions, all the titles, all the talks have been threaded there. So if you have any questions, it's a good, now's a good time to sort of get them in as we start to move into our Q&A session. We did really good on time. So if you have the extra bandwidth and you can stick around, that would be great. It's been a while since we had a meetup, so it's really good being here. So with that, I'm going to say farewell because I do have to go. But and there are some great questions for John that I'm going to kick it back to Angelica, the host. But before I jump off, I really want to thank everyone again for joining us today, the speakers. Angelica, you're the greatest. Thanks for making this happen, and for everyone that was involved. Really happy to be part of this community, and looking forward to seeing folks at GopherCon next week. Feel free to hit me up on Twitter or on Gopher Slack. And for those who have my email and number, those lines are open too. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Awesome. So what I think we'll do is I'll dive straight into questions for John, and then I'll go through the other talks and see if any other questions have been added since we originally put the threads up. So I'm going to dive straight in. So for you, John, were the Lambda function calls quick to spin up? Did you do anything to keep that time manageable?
So yeah, actually with the Go-based Lambdas, they do spin up pretty quickly. The cold start times are definitely acceptable. When it has been hit for a while, there's definite notice delay of all the first time actions. And it's like about in a second or so for each action. So like if I know a pointing session's happening, I'll probably just go to pointing points and click through some things to pre-warm up the Lambdas, or just, let the first users experience a little bit of delay. I will say that it was definitely nowhere near as much as a startup delay as I've experienced with some other languages. So like doing a Java-based Lambda, the cold start times are just terrible. But using Go definitely mitigated that.
Awesome. The next question is from Tim. Does Terraform actually support deploying the logic for Lambda functions, or do you still have to do something like upload zips?
It actually does support deploying the Lambda functions, which is definitely very nice. So if you check out the Terraform for it, the Lambda modules, it basically has a source that like backtracks out of the Terraform directory and enters the build directory of the project. So when you deploy, you do like a make build, and it builds a front end, and it builds all the Lambda code, and then doing your Terraform deploy actually picks that up. It's a little bit different because I deploy it from my laptop, but I've seen that work in the past with like packaging things up as a zip, a deployable zip, where you've got a zip file that contains the built Lambdas as well as the Terraform, and then you just blow it out into a way that Terraform, or that all the paths work.
So, and I've got one more. Do you see any instances in which this sort of architecture would be better than traditional methods?
Well, yeah. So like specifically my use case where I don't want to be paying for servers running all the time, it definitely is nice. I don't know in like a full-on professional application, the tons of small Lambdas, I'm still kind of back and forth on it. It has some advantages because each Lambda is tiny. So like understanding what one little function does is super easy. I mean, you're jumping in and you're only looking at like a couple hundred lines of code. Well, the Lambda itself shouldn't be that much at all. And then you got, a couple hundred lines of code between all the dependencies. You still get reused that way. But it is definitely different. And I would love to play with it on a bigger scale and something that had more traffic and more members working on it, to say for sure.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, I had a quick skim through the channel and I can't see any extra questions since we kind of went through the first one. But if anyone has any questions for any of our speakers, feel free to ping in the chat. If the speakers don't mind hanging around a little bit. If not, then that's kind of the end of the programming. But as I say, feel free to kind of virtually sit around and ping in the channel or chat a little bit. Yeah, thank you, everyone. I'm just going to stand here and wait a little bit to give people space if they want to think of last minute questions. But if not, thank you so much again to all the speakers. Really appreciate you saying yes at such short notice. I pinged you saying, hey, I'm thinking we should do a meetup in a week. Let's make it happen.
Thanks, Angelica, for making this happen. And until we can all actually meet in person again, that will happen in the future. I do believe we'll get through this, and yeah. Keep going.
Keep going.
No
Your
one?
community
Okay.
always keep going. We'll keep going on our rainbows and our positivity.
No, I think that going. No, okay, cool. I'll leave.
Oh, sorry, I completely.
I'll take my. I'll slowly walk away. I'll slowly get out of there. Yeah.
Well, that was on me. I should have got that. Yeah. Hashtag keep going. Make
That's
it a
okay,
thing.
it's on my slide.
Yeah, I shamelessly stole that from Tony.
Perfect.
Awesome. Well, there doesn't seem to be any more questions, so I think we'll wrap up. But thank you, everyone. All the speakers are wonderful people, so do feel free to reach out to them on Gopher Slack if you have any questions that kind of come to mind afterwards. But if not, see some of you at GopherCon.
Oh, bye now.
Bye, everyone.